There was no breaking news countdown, no emergency summit, no dramatic announcement warning the world that something big had just changed. But one decision quietly reshaped the global oil market almost overnight. When Donald Trump cut off Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba, most people assumed it was about punishment, about pressure, about reminding the region who was in charge, and on the surface, that's exactly what it looked like. Cuba's lights began flickering out. Venezuela's oil system slipped deeper into chaos. Washington projected strength, but while everyone focused on the immediate fallout, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. A country that wasn't in the headlines saw an opening, a rare one, and within days it was moving to take control of a market no one expected it to dominate. That country was Canada. And what happened next would reshape energy politics far beyond the Western Hemisphere. Trump's announcement was blunt: no more Venezuelan oil to Cuba, no more subsidized shipments, no more energy lifeline. For years, Cuba had survived on Venezuelan crude. The deal was simple: oil in exchange for security and military cooperation. It wasn't generous, but it kept the country running. Trump ended that arrangement instantly. He made it clear there would be zero oil, zero money, no exceptions. The impact was immediate. Cuba's power grid, already fragile, buckled under the strain. Blackouts spread across the island, transportation slowed, industry stalled. The entire system depended on petroleum, and suddenly that supply was gone. But Cuba wasn't the real story, because Trump didn't just cut shipments. His administration announced it was taking control of Venezuelan oil flows altogether, redirecting exports and prioritizing American refineries. It looked like a show of dominance, but it also triggered a chain reaction no one in Washington was talking about. By the time Trump made his move, Venezuela's oil industry was already broken. Pipelines hadn't been modernized in half a century. Refineries ran with outdated equipment. Maintenance had been postponed year after year. Skilled engineers had left the country. At its peak in the 1970s, Venezuela pumped nearly 4 million barrels per day. Before Trump's announcement, production had collapsed to under 1 million. And even that reduced output came at enormous cost. Venezuela's own state oil company admitted that restoring production would require tens of billions of dollars in investment. Some estimates put the number near 60 billion. That kind of rebuilding doesn't happen quickly. Even with foreign money, it takes years to replace pipelines, retrain workers, and rebuild infrastructure. And that assumes political stability, legal protections, and investor confidence. Venezuela had none of those, which meant Trump wasn't cutting off a strong competitor. He was cutting off a supplier that couldn't recover anytime soon, and that created a dangerous gap in the global oil market. Not all oil is interchangeable. Venezuelan crude is heavy, thick, and high in sulfur. It requires specialized refineries designed specifically to handle it. For years, Venezuela supplied those refineries reliably. China built major facilities around Venezuelan heavy crude. India did the same on a smaller scale. Even American Gulf Coast refineries depended on it. When Trump redirected Venezuelan oil toward the United States, the supply didn't vanish. But it stopped flowing to Asia. And suddenly, China and India had a serious problem. Their refineries couldn't just switch to lighter oil without expensive adjustments. Shutting down wasn't an option. And alternative heavy crude suppliers were limited. That's when buyers started scrambling. And that scramble led them to one country that had been preparing quietly for years. Canadian heavy crude from the Alberta oil sands is remarkably similar to Venezuelan oil. Same thickness, same sulfur content, same refinery compatibility. For years, Canadian producers competed directly with Venezuela for the same refineries. When Venezuelan supply collapsed in the 2010s, U.S. refiners switched to Canadian oil and never switched back. But there was one limitation: Canada was trapped. Without access to tidewater, most Canadian oil had to flow south into the United States. Asia was out of reach. That changed with the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. After years of delays, protests, and legal challenges, the pipeline finally came online. Suddenly, Canadian oil could reach the Pacific coast at scale. From there, tankers could ship heavy crude directly to China, India, Japan, and South Korea. When Venezuelan supply collapsed again, Canada wasn't scrambling, it was ready. And Asian refiners noticed immediately. China and India weren't reacting emotionally to Trump's move. They were reacting strategically. For years, both countries had depended on Venezuelan heavy crude to keep specific refineries running, not because it was cheap, not because it was friendly, but because it worked. And suddenly, that supply became unreliable overnight. Trump's decision redirected Venezuelan oil toward the United States, leaving Asian buyers exposed. Refineries that had been designed around heavy crude couldn't simply switch inputs without disruption. Shutting down wasn't an option. Waiting for Venezuela to recover wasn't realistic. So Asian energy buyers did what they always do in moments like this. They looked for the most boring option available. Canada fit perfectly. Canadian heavy crude matched Venezuelan specifications closely enough that refiners could transition without major overhauls. Production was stable, contracts were enforceable, and unlike other suppliers, Canada didn't come with sudden sanctions, military risks, or internal collapse. That mattered more than price. In recent years, Asian refiners had watched supplier after supplier become unpredictable. Venezuela collapsed under mismanagement. Russia's exports became vulnerable to sanctions. Middle Eastern supplies faced constant geopolitical tension. Canadian oil didn't dominate headlines, and that was exactly the point. Negotiations moved fast but quietly. These weren't emergency purchases meant to last a few months. Reports suggested long-term supply discussions, multi-year commitments, and strategic partnerships designed to lock in reliability. Once a refinery commits to a supplier, everything changes. Logistics chains are optimized, blending formulas are adjusted, long-term shipping contracts are signed. At that point, switching suppliers isn't just inconvenient, it's expensive. Even if Venezuelan oil eventually returns to the market, Asian refiners will already have rebuilt their systems around Canadian supply. And when something works, energy markets don't rush to change it. That's how a temporary disruption turns into a permanent shift. In the oil world, switching suppliers isn't a simple decision. It's a structural one. Refineries aren't flexible machines that can take any crude you pour in. They are engineered around very specific oil characteristics: density, sulfur content, viscosity, and chemical composition. Even small changes require recalibration, testing, and risk. That's why the first supplier a refinery locks into often becomes the long-term supplier. When Asian refiners began adjusting their systems to handle Canadian heavy crude, they weren't just placing temporary orders. They were committing to an entire supply chain. Shipping routes were redesigned, blending ratios were adjusted, storage and handling systems were optimized for Canadian specifications. Once that happens, reversing course becomes costly. Switching back to Venezuelan oil in the future wouldn't just mean signing a new contract. It would mean retraining operators, rebalancing refinery processes, renegotiating shipping logistics, and accepting downtime risk. For energy companies operating on tight margins, that kind of disruption is rarely worth it. History shows how sticky these decisions can be. When Venezuelan production collapsed in the early 2010s, U.S. Gulf Coast refineries that had relied on Venezuelan heavy crude turned to Canada instead. Even when Venezuela partially restored output later, those refineries didn't go back. The Canadian supply chain was already working, and changing it again made no financial sense. The same pattern is now emerging in Asia. By the time Venezuela could realistically rebuild its oil infrastructure, if it ever does, Asian refiners will already be deeply integrated with Canadian suppliers. Long-term contracts will be in place, operational systems will be optimized, business relationships will be established. At that point, Venezuelan oil won't be competing for an open market. It will be trying to displace something that already works. And in energy markets, that's one of the hardest battles to win. What started as an energy decision quickly turned into a geopolitical shift. As Canadian oil began flowing toward Asia, Canada wasn't just selling more barrels. It was quietly changing its position in the global system. For decades, Canada's energy sector had been tied almost entirely to the United States. Most Canadian oil flowed south. American refineries were the primary customers. That dependence limited Canada's leverage in trade disputes and energy negotiations. This moment changed that balance. With direct access to Asian markets, Canada suddenly had alternatives. U.S. refineries still mattered, but they were no longer the only option. And when a country has options, its negotiating position improves instantly. That shift matters when tariffs are threatened. It matters during trade disputes. And it matters when political pressure is applied. Canada doesn't need to confront the United States openly to benefit. The leverage comes from quiet optionality, the ability to redirect supply if needed. This also reshaped domestic politics inside Canada. Pipeline projects that were once framed purely as environmental flashpoints began to be discussed as strategic assets. The argument wasn't just about profit anymore. It was about resilience, diversification, and national security. Energy infrastructure became less about dependency and more about independence. The irony is that none of this required Canada to challenge American policy directly. The shift happened because global buyers reacted to instability elsewhere and chose the safest alternative available. Trump's move was designed to project power and control energy flows. Instead, it accelerated Canada's pivot away from U.S. dependence and strengthened Canada's long-term position on the global stage. Sometimes influence doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from being the backup plan everyone quietly prepares for. Trump's decision was meant to send a message. It was supposed to punish Cuba, isolate Venezuela, and reassert American dominance over energy flows in the Western Hemisphere. On the surface, it worked. Cuba faced blackouts. Venezuela's oil system sank deeper into crisis. Washington looked decisive. But geopolitics rarely stop at first-order effects. Because while attention stayed locked on the immediate damage, a much quieter shift was unfolding elsewhere. By cutting off Venezuelan oil and redirecting supply toward the United States, Trump forced Asian energy buyers into a corner. China and India couldn't wait for Venezuela to recover. They couldn't risk unstable suppliers. They needed a solution that worked immediately. Canada was ready. The infrastructure was in place, the oil was compatible, the supply was stable. And unlike other producers, Canada didn't come with sudden sanctions, military risks, or political chaos. So Asian refiners adapted. Contracts were signed. Supply chains were reorganized. Systems were recalibrated around Canadian crude. What started as a reaction became a commitment, and once those commitments are made, they tend to last. The result is a long-term shift that few anticipated. Canada reduces its dependence on the United States without confrontation. Asian markets gain a reliable supplier, and Venezuela remains sidelined for years, possibly longer. The most striking part is the irony. A move designed to tighten American control over energy markets ended up creating the conditions for Canadian energy independence. Trump aimed to demonstrate power. Instead, he reshaped the board in a way that benefited a close ally. This is how global influence often changes, not through dramatic speeches, not through military force, but through unintended consequences that reward whoever is prepared to fill the gap. And this time, Canada was ready.